Chapter 15. Kitty's friends were very glad to welcome her at their camp in Granite Basin. The incident which had so rudely broken the seclusion of their honeymoon had been too nearly a tragedy to be easily forgotten. The charm of the place in some degree for them was lost, and Kitty's coming helped to dispel the cloud that had little overshadowed those last days in their outing. It was not at all difficult for them to persuade Kitty to remain longer than one night that she had planned, and accompany them back to Prescott. From Prescott, Stanford must go to the mines and take up his work, and to arrange for Helen's coming later, and Helen would go home with Kitty for the visit that she had promised. The cowboys, who were returning to the Cross Triangle Ranch, would take Kitty's horse to her home and carry a message explaining the young woman's absence, and ask that someone be sent to Prescott with the clothing that she would need in town, and that the Reed automobile might be in Prescott in readiness to take the two young women back to the ranch on the appointed day. Kitty could not bring herself to tell Helen about her engagement to Lawrence Knight, or Patches, as she would continue to call him, until the time came for the cowboy himself to make his true name and character known. It had all happened so suddenly. The promises of the future were so wonderful, so far beyond the young woman's fondest dreams, that she herself could scarcely realize the truth. There would be time enough to tell Helen when they were together at the ranch, and she was insistent, too, that Patches must not interview her father until she herself had returned home. Phil and his cowboys with the cattle reached the Cross Triangle corrals the evening before the day set for Kitty and Helen to arrive at the ranch on the other side of the valley meadows. The Cross Triangle men were greeted by the news that Professor Parkhill had said goodbye to Williamson Valley, and that the Pothook S ranch had been sold. The eastern purchaser, expected by Reed, had arrived on the day that Kitty had gone to the Granite Basin, and the deal had been closed without delay. But Reed was not to give up possession of the property until after the fall rodeo. As the men sat under the walnut trees with the dean that evening, discussing the incidences of the Granite Basin work and speculating about the new owner of the neighboring ranch, Phil sat with little Billy apart from the circle and contributed to the conversation only now and then a word or a brief answer in some question. When Miss Baldwin persuaded the child that it was bedtime, Phil slipped quietly away in the darkness, and they didn't see him again until after breakfast the next morning. When breakfast was over, the foreman gave a few directions to his men and then rode away alone. The dean, understanding the lad, whom he loved as one of his own sons, watched him go without a word or a question. To Miss Baldwin he said, "Just let him alone, Stella. The boy is all right. He'll only be gone off somewhere on the range to fight it out alone. Most likely he'll put in the day watching those wild horses over there behind Tule Mountain. He generally goes by them when he's bothered about anything or in trouble of any sort." Patches, who had been sent on an errand of some kind to Fair Oaks, was returning home early in the afternoon and had reached the neighborhood of that spring where he had first encountered Nick Cambert, when he heard a calf bawling lustily somewhere in the cedar timber not too far away. Familiar as he was now with the voices of the ranges, the cowboy knew that the calf was in trouble. The call was one of fright and pain. Turning aside from his course, he rode rapidly at first, and then more cautiously towards the sound. Presently he caught the whiff of a smoke that came with the light breeze from somewhere ahead on the ridge along where he was riding. Instantly he rode into a thick clump of cedars and dismounted and tied his horse. Then he went on, carefully and silently on foot. Soon he heard voices. Again the calf bawled in fright and pain, and the familiar odor of burning hair was carried to him on the breeze. Someone was branding a calf. It might be all right. It might not. Patches was unarmed, but with a characteristic disregard of consequences, he crept slowly forward towards a dense growth of trees and brush, from beyond which the noise and the smoke seemed to come. He had barely gained the cover when he heard someone on the other side ride rapidly down the ridge. Hastily parting the brush, he looked through to catch a glimpse of the horseman. But he was a moment too late. The rider had disappeared from sight into the timber. But in the open space beyond the cedars, the cowboy saw Yokpai Joe standing beside a calf, freshly branded with the 4 bar M iron and earmarked with the Tally Holt marks. Patches knew instantly, as well as though he had witnessed the actual branding, what had happened. That part of the range was seldom visited, except by the Dean's cowboys and the Tally Holt mountain men. Knowing that the Cross Triangle riders were all at the Granite Basin, were making good use of their opportunities. The man who had ridden away so hurriedly, a moment too soon for Patches to see him, was, without a doubt, driving the mother of the calf to a distance that would effectually separate her from her offspring. But, while he was so sure in his own mind, the Cross Triangle man, as to what had happened before, had arrived at the scene too late. He had no positive evidence that the animal just branded was not the legal property of Nick Cambert. As Patches stepped from the brush, Joe faced him for a moment in guilty astonishment and fear, and then he ran towards his horse. "Wait a minute, Joe," called Patches. "What good will it do for you to run now? I'm not going to harm you." Joe stopped and stood hesitating in indecision, watching the intruder with that sneaking sideways look. "Come on, Joe. Let's have us a little talk about this business," the Cross Triangle man said in a matter-of-fact tone, as he seated himself on a large flat-topped stone near the little fire. "You know you can't get away, so you might as well." I ain't telling nobody nothing," said Joe sullenly, as he came slowly towards the Dean's cowboy. "No?" said Patches. "No, I ain't," asserted the Tally Holt man stoutly. "That there calf is 4 bar M calf, all right." "I see that it is," returned the Cross Triangle rider calmly. "But I'll just wait until Nick gets back and ask him what it was before when he worked over with it the iron." Joe, excited and confused by the cool nerve of this man, fell readily into the verbal trap. You better go now and not wait to ask Nick no fool questions like that. If he finds you here talking with me when he gets back, hell be a poppin' for sure. Me and you are friends, Patches, and that's why I'm telling you better pull your freight while the going is good." "Much obliged, Joe, but there's no hurry. You don't need to be so rushed. It'll be an hour before Nick gets back if he drives that cow as far as he ought to." Again, poor Yokpai Joe told more than he intended. "You don't need worry about Nick. He'll sure drive her far enough. He ain't taking no chances, Nick, he ain't, no, sir." With his convictions so readily confirmed, Patches had good ground upon which to base his following remarks. He had made a long shot when he spoke so confidently of the brand on the calf being worked over. For, of course, the calf might not have been branded at all when the Tally Holt man caught it, but Joe's manner, as well as his warning answer, told him that the shot had gone home. The fact that the brand had been worked over established also the fact that it was the Cross Triangle brand that had been changed, because the Cross Triangle was the only brand in that part of the country that could be changed over to the 4 bar M. Patches dropped his easy manner and spoke straight to the point. "Look here, Joe. You and me might as well get down to cases. You know I'm your friend, and I don't want to see you in trouble, but you can take it from me that you're in mighty serious trouble right now. I was hiding right back in those bushes, close enough to see it all happen, and I know that this is a cross triangle calf, and that you and Nick worked that brand over. You know that it means the penitentiary for you as well as Nick, if the boys don't string you up both without any ceremony." Patches let his words sink in. Joe's face was ashy white, and he was shaking with fright as he stole a sneaking look towards his horse. Patches added sharply, "You can't give me the slip either. I can kill you before you get halfway to your horse." Trapped and helpless, Joe looked pleadingly at his captor. "You wouldn't send me up to the penitentiary, would you, now, Patches?" he whined. "You and me, we good friends, ain't we? Anyway, he wouldn't let me go to the pen, and the boys wouldn't dasn't do nothing to me when they knew." "Who are you talking about?" demanded Patches. "Nick? Don't be a fool, Joe. Nick will be here right alongside with you." I didn't mean Nick. I mean him over there on the cross triangle. Professor Parkhill. I'm telling you that he wouldn't let you do nothing to me." "Forget it, Joe," came the reply without an instant hesitation. "You know as well as I do how much chance Professor Parkhill or anyone else would have to try and keep the boys from making you and Nick dance on nothing, once they hear of this. Besides, the professor's not in the valley anymore." The poor outcast's fright was pitiful. You ain't meaning that he's gone?" he gasped. "Listen, Joe," said Patches quickly. "I can do more for you than he could, even if he were here. You know I'm your friend, and I don't want to see a good fellow like you sent to prison for 15-20 years, or even hanged. But there's only one way that I can see to save you. You must come with me to the Cross Triangle and tell Mr. Baldwin all about it, and how you were just working for Nick, and how he made you help him do this, and all that you know. If you do that, we can get you off." I reckon you're right, Patches," returned the frightened weakling sullenly. Nick has always treated me like a dog anyway. You won't let Nick get me, will you, if I go?" "Nothing can get at you, Joe, if you go with me, and if you do the square thing. I'm going to take care of you myself and help you get out of this and brace up and be a man. Come on, we got to get going. I'll turn this calf loose, though, first." He was bending over the calf when a noise in the brush caused him to stand suddenly erect. Joe was whimpering with terror. Patches said fiercely, but in a low tone, "Shut up and follow my lead. Be a man, and I'll get you out of this yet." "Nick will kill us, sure," whined Joe. "Not if I get my hands on him first, he won't," retorted Patches. But it was a feeling of relief that the cowboy saw Phil Acton ride towards them from the shelter of the timber. Before Patches could speak, Phil's gun covered him, and the foreman's voice rang out sharply. "Hands up!" Joe's hands shot over his head, and Patches hesitated. "Quick," said Phil. And as Patches saw the man's eyes over the black barrel of the weapon, he obeyed, but as he raised his hands, a dull flush of anger colored his tanned face a deeper red, and his eyes grew dark with passion. He realized his situation instantly. The mystery that surrounded his first appearance when he sought employment at the Cross Triangle, the persistent suspicion of many of the cowboys because of his friendship for Yaqui Joe, with his meeting with Joe, which the professor had reported, his refusal to explain to Phil his return to the ranch when everyone was away and he himself was supposed to be in Prescott. All these and many more incidences had come to their legitimate climax in his presence on that spot with Yock by Joe, the smoldering fire, and the freshly branded calf. He was unarmed, but Phil could not be sure that, for many a cowboy carries his gun inside the leg of his leather chaps, where it would not so easily catch on the brush. But while Patches saw it all so clearly, he was enraged that this man with whom he had lived so intimately should believe him capable of such a crime, and treat him without question as a common cattle thief. Phil's coolness towards him, which had grown so gradually during the past 3 months, in this humiliation reached a point beyond which Patch's patience and consideration and endurance could not go. The man's sense of justice was outraged. His fine feeling of honor was insulted. Trapped and helpless as he was, under the menacing gun, he was possessed by a determination to defend himself against the accusation, and to teach Phil Acton that there was a limit to the insult he would endure, even in the name of friendship. To this end, his only hope was to trap his foreman with words, as he had caught Yock by Joe. At a game of words, Honorable Patches was no unskilled novice. Controlling his anger, he said coldly with biting sarcasm, while he looked at the cowboy with a mocking sneer, "You don't propose to take any chances, do you, holding up an unarmed man?" Patches saw by the flush that swept over Phil's cheeks how his words bit. "I don't take chances with your kind," retorted the foreman hotly. "No," mocked Patches, "but it will pay big, I suppose, for the great wild horse Phil to be branded as a sneak and a coward who's afraid to face an unarmed man unless he can get the drop on him." Phil was goaded to madness by the cool, mocking words. With a reckless laugh, he slipped his weapon into the holster and sprang to the ground. At the same moment, Patches and Joe lowered their hands, and Joe, unnoticed by either of the angry men, took a stealthy step towards his horse. Patches deliberately folded his arms and stood looking at Patches. "I'll just call your bluff, you sneaking calf stealer," he said coolly. "Now, unlimber that gun of yours and get busy." Angry as he was, Patches felt a thrill of admiration for the man, and beneath his determination to force Phil Acton to treat him with respect, he was proud of his friend, who answered his sneering insinuations with such fearlessness. But he could not now hesitate in his plan of provoking Phil into disarming himself. "You're something of a four-flusher yourself, aren't you?" he mocked. "You know I have no gun. Your brave pose is so effective. I would congratulate you, only you see, it doesn't impress me in the least." With an oath, Phil snatched his gun from the holster and threw it aside. "Well, have it any way you like," he retorted, and started towards Patches. Then a curious thing happened, Honorable Patches. Angry as he was, he became suddenly dominated by something that was more potent than his rage. "Stop!" he cried sharply, and with such ringing force that Phil involuntarily obeyed. "I can't fight you this way, Phil," he said, and the other, wondering, saw that whimsical self-mocking smile on his lips. "You know as well as I do that you're no match for me barehanded. You couldn't even touch me. You've seen Curly and the others try it often enough. You are as helpless in my power now as I was in yours a moment ago. I'm armed now, and you're not. I can't fight you this way, Phil." In spite of himself, Phil Acton was impressed by the truth and fairness of Patch's words. He realized that an unequal contest would satisfy neither of them, and that it made no difference which of the contestants had the advantage. "Well," he said sarcastically, "what are you going to do about it?" "First," returned Patches calmly, "I'm going to tell you how I happened to be here with Yock by Joe." "I don't need any explanations from you. It's probably more your personal business, I suppose," retorted Phil. Patches controlled himself. "You're going to hear the explanation just the same," he returned. "You can believe it or not, just as you please." "And then what?" demanded Phil. "Then I'm going to go get a gun and we'll settle the rest of it, man to man, on equal terms, just as soon as you like," answered Patches deliberately. Phil replied shortly, "Well, go ahead with your talk. I'll hand it to you when it comes to talk. I'm not educated the way you are." For a moment Patches hesitated, as though on the point of changing his mind about his explanation, and then a sense of justice both for Phil and himself, conquered. But in telling Phil how he had come upon the scene too late for positive proof that the freshly branded calf was the Dean's property, and explaining now, when the foreman arrived, he had just persuaded Joe to go with him to give the necessary evidence against Nick, Patches forgot the possible effect of his words upon Joe himself. The two cross-triangle men were so absorbed in their own affair that they had paid no attention to the Tallyholt mountain outcast, and Joe, taking advantage of the opportunity, by this time gained a position beside his horse. As he heard Patches tell how he had no actual evidence that the calf was not Nick Cambert's property, a look of anger and cunning darkness come over the face of Nick's follower. He was angry at the way Patches had tricked him into betraying both himself and his evil master, and he saw a way to defeat the two cowboys and at the same time win Nick's approval. Quickly the fellow mounted his horse, and before they could stop him, was out of sight in the timber. "Dang it! I've done it now," yelled Patches in dismay. "I forgot all about Joe. I don't think he counts for much in this game anyway," returned Phil gruffly. As he spoke, the foreman turned his back to Patches and walked towards his gun. He had reached the spot where the weapon lay, went from the brush to the right, and a little back of Patches he stood watching his companion. A shot rang out with startling suddenness. Patches saw Phil stumble forward, straightened for an instant as though by sheer power of his will, turned and looked back at him. End of part 1 of 2.